everybody hanging in there with these lessons. We're getting to the real practical part of the classes, but we're still trying to just build a good foundation of knowledge. And the main purpose of today's class is to keep building this language so we can have a shared conversation about gardening. I've found in the past when I try to just jump right to the practical lessons, I have to break, or it becomes choppy because I have to stop and explain what things mean and so forth. And so yeah, this is the idea of just trying to build that common language between everybody so that we can have a good productive conversation about how to run a really good productive garden. Use productive too many times there, but you get the point. Okay, let's go. I've started off with the most sort of practical classifications, and we've already talked about these ones, but I'll just go over just so we can make sure. We have our annuals, which are our garden plants that they go through their entire life cycle from seed to cotyledon stage to juvenile to mature stage and produce seeds all in one season. I have a star beside tomato here because it is considered an annual because it will produce seeds in its first year. But a lot of people, even my sister and my niece, and I've met people who have kept their tomato plants alive in a sunny kitchen for like multiple years. So it could be considered more in this area, but yeah, they'll produce their own seed in the first year, and it's good seed. So then we take a look at our biennials, and I put these biennials here because I'll talk more about them when we talk more about seed saving. But if you were to hypothetically grow any of these in your garden and they go to flower and seed in the first year, you typically don't want to use that seed because you would be selecting for an unfavorable trait. It's supposed to be a biennial, and to save seed from, say, a Swiss chard that was just stressed out and goes to flower and seed early, you're selecting for a very unfavorable trait that you carry those genes forwards, and you'll have more and more Swiss chard that bolts too early, rather than the healthy Swiss chard that makes it through the season, makes it through the winter, comes back the next year, and then starts to do its mature flowering and seed producing stage. And then I put a little star beside dill because I've found that I've saved quite a few dill seed over the years, and I haven't treated it as an annual, or I haven't treated it as a biennial. I've treated it as an annual, and it's produced seed, and I found the seed was fine. So I know it's a biennial, but I have saved seed from it and treated it like an annual. And then this is our list of our perennials that are mostly good to grow in the Bow Valley. They are very, very hardy, so they deal really well with our cold winters. But I do have some stars next to the rosemary, thyme, and oregano, because they will grow over multiple seasons, but they're not quite cold hardy enough for our winters. And what I do with them, and actually I took this trick from this awesome Italian gardener called Carmelo. He had this potted up rosemary, a couple really big potted up rosemary bushes that me. And so thyme and oregano, they won't make it through the winter, but you can grow them outside and then put them in a pot and put them in a south facing window over the winter, and then you take them back out in the next summer, the next growing season, and that works really well. These three, they're very slow growing woody herbs, and so if you start them from seed or from a cutting in that first season, don't really expect to get anything off them, because they need to get established before you can start harvesting them. And so this is the trick. I didn't think I could grow any of these and actually use them, because they weren't making it through the winters the first couple seasons. But then I saw Carmelo's trick. He had the rosemary just potted up in this huge pot, and it was probably about, I mean, the pot included, it was as tall as both of us were, and he wheeled it in and out on a dolly. So he probably had that rosemary plant for about 10 years. So that's the way, if you want to grow those, that's the little tip on how to do them. And then I have a couple other things in here. I have the raspberry and the apple and the Saskatoons and the strawberries. They are perennials. They would do well in this climate. They're delicious, but I don't really recommend growing those in town here. They are very intensely attractive for wildlife, and we want to grow as much food as we can here in the Bow Valley, but we want to do it responsible and avoid human and wildlife conflicts. So as much as I'm sure everybody would love to grow those, it's just a little too dicey. So I can't particularly recommend them for that reason. The next, this is kind of like, might seem obvious or might seem confusing, but another way of classifying plants is calling them either woody or herbaceous. And most people, when they think about the word herb, they think about like a culinary herb, like a rosemary or oregano or basil. But botanically speaking, the word herb specifically refers to any plant that doesn't have a woody stem and will die down after flowering or at the end of the growing season. So like technically, by that definition, lettuce is an herb. And we commonly, because we think about herbs as in the culinary sense, we wouldn't think about that. But I just have to kind of go out there and say that just in case it slips out. If I call something a plant that is botanically an herb, and somebody out there is like, what is he talking about? That's not an herb. So we talked about the difference between like succulent, like apples and tomatoes are considered fruits in our mind, but botanically, anything, even like a seed, a pea pod or a bean pod is a fruit, So just trying to clear that up in case I say that and it confuses somebody. And then, so like dill is an example of both a culinary herb and an herbaceous plant, because it doesn't have any woody growth on it. So I hope that's not confusing. Ooh, can we see it? Okay, so then with that conversation about like woody plants versus herbaceous plants, even a woody plant can have herbaceous growth. So these are two pictures of what I believe is poplar, and you can see that this was last year's growth right here. And so it is like a little bit herbaceous still. I talked about last class how every growing season, a woody plant will create a certain amount of herbaceous growth at that apical tip. And at mid-season, it kind of shuts down that growth and puts the sugars, directs all the extra energy, the sugars back down to the root system. But I noticed this weekend when I was down by the river, and you can see that this was last year's growth, and it's already set up to unfurl its leaves at its buds. And what's really cool is you can see, I hope you guys can see right there by the little laser pointer thing, you can actually see some of that sap that's coming out of the leaf bud. That's that woody plant that's pushing that extra sugary growth right up, and it's ready as soon as it gets the right message from the hours of daylight and the right temperature, then it's going to sprout. And so we can see that. But also, if you look up here, we're not the only ones who know about that soft, sugary growth. This, if you walk along the river or anywhere, you'll see a lot of this pattern. This was right at my eye level. And so this is like the elk and the deer know that the plants are pushing up that sugary sap from their root system, getting ready for the spring. And the deer and the elk, they can't eat there's not a lot of grass to be eaten at this point. So they will nip the tip off of a lot of these woody plants it's relatively herbaceous still. It's still not as tough as the rest of it. And just to explain, so when we talk about herbs and herbaceous growth, the thyme, rosemary, oregano, and sage are culinary herbs, but they're woody because of their stems. And then contrasting that, there are plants like rhubarb, which is a perennial, but it's herbaceous. So if you see the way it grows, every winter it'll die back down to its root system and sprout an entirely new shoot system every year. Does anybody have questions about that? So,
don't see any.
Okay, thank you. So then the next thing, I like to, there are some crops that I call cut and come back again. And these are some crops that I really, really recommend. You can get a lot more harvest out of that. And so you can see in this picture, there is a row of lettuce, or actually that'd be spinach that I had just cut. And a lot of people might think, or maybe some novice gardeners might think that once you cut a crop like that, then it's all over. But there are actually a number of crops. If you grow them to a baby stage like this, you can get 2 or 3 cuttings off of them before you need to replant. So just knowing that is can increase your ability to produce more in a shorter period of time and save you a little bit of work. And then I put Italian chicory down here. That's my little joke. I know a lot of people don't like dandelions, but dandelions were brought over by like the French peasant settlers originally, and a lot of Italian people love dandelions as well. So there's been times in the garden where I've planted dandelion, like a specific cultivated variety of dandelion, and you add it into your salad mixes, and if you call it Italian chicory instead of dandelion, people think it's fancy. And it's actually really, really well adapted to our climate. And when you cut it at the right early stage, it's actually got a very pleasant flavor to it. So,
Christian, when you're cutting back one of these come back again crops, how much should you leave on the plant?
Yeah, just a couple inches. Yeah. And then the next time it grows up, then I would harvest like a 1/2 inch above it, and then the next time a 1/2 inch above that. And to be fair, in the middle of the summer when the heat is on, some of these crops, you might only get 1 extra cutting off of it, whereas in the cooler season when they're not as stressed, you could get 2 or 3 off of them, especially spinach, because I talked about spinach being that long day flowering. It triggers, it bolts, so you won't get as many cuttings off of spinach later into the middle of the summer as you would on the edges. And then there are some crops that we call continuous producers that I really highly recommend. Again, if you can grow something and get multiple weeks harvest off them, rather than just like growing them and having to harvest them it all and then starting all over again from seed, then this is a really advantageous thing to grow. So in this column over here, these are plants that once they start producing, once they get to the right stage of their development for you to start harvesting, then they'll pretty much harvest all season long. So kale, collard greens, Swiss chard, parsley, all of those. And the first year I didn't understand this. So I grew the kale or the Swiss chard and it got to a certain size and I just harvested it and I started all over again. And then since then, I think even that winter I read one of my books and it explained that the apical growth for those plants comes right up the middle. And then down on the lower part of the stem, that's the older or more original leaves. And so you just pick the leaves off and you let it keep on growing up the middle. And though these are just great plants to grow just because they won't stop once you get going on them. So chives and mint are great as well. Harvest them a little bit differently. You can cut them like a cut and come back again kind of crop, but they just keep on coming. Same with sorrel, which is a really, really great crop. It's a perennial too. So once that's planted, that just produces every year. It's very, very little work. Tomatoes, I guess I should have said there's 2 different kinds of tomatoes, varieties of tomatoes to speak broadly. There's indeterminate vining tomatoes. And once they start to get to that flowering and fruiting stage, then they produce the rest of the time. Whereas there's determinate bush variety tomatoes and they'll flower and fruit all at once. So I should have made like a little distinction there, but. And then the other one is the woody culinary herbs, the oregano, the sage, marjoram, rosemary. But I already explained how those need some 1 or 2 years of establishment before you can really start picking them. But once they do get established, like I said with Carmelo's rosemary bush, they're pretty good to go. And then over here, these crops over here, they are continuous producers, but they start to lose energy and productivity after 3 to 4 weeks. So you get a nice wide window of harvesting them over a number of weeks, but it's not going to last all year. So snap peas, those are probably my favorite thing to plant. They'll be very productive for 3 or 4 weeks before they start to dwindle out. But what I do in order to make sure we can harvest the whole season is that I'll plant them 2 or 3 weeks apart. And then I'll do that from the start of April to the first week of June. And so I'll just plant a certain amount every couple weeks, and you got snap peas just producing all season long until we get the frost. Yeah, zucchini, the same thing. Not quite. Zucchini's very frost sensitive, so you can't put zucchini or cucumber or melon outdoors or anywhere that's going to get frost. And our frost-free window starts around the 3rd week of May, And so by the time you get the zucchini in on the third week of May, start of June, then it takes another about a month before it starts flowering. And, you know, so if that takes us to the start of July, and so they'll produce really well pretty much throughout the. I don't succession plant them the same way as I do with the peas because just the window's a little bit tighter due to the frost sensitiveness, where snap peas, when they just get planted, they're super hardy to cold. And then basil, yeah, you can. I'll talk a little bit more about the way you kind of pinch basil and keep it productive over a number of weeks. Any questions for continuous producers? Good to go. Sweet. Okay, and then you got your quick crops. There are a handful of really cold hardy, really quick growing crops that we can grow here in the Bow Valley and enjoy some success. So you can see here radishes. Once they sprout from the ground, you can expect them to be in the harvestable stage within 4 to 5 weeks. And so the days to maturity, I'm saying mature for harvesting purposes, not mature in terms of what I said last week about the flowering stage being mature. This is where things might start to get a little bit confusing. But the days to maturity is a terminology used by growers, and it's not specifically like the botanical mature of producing seeds. But you can see radishes are really quick. Curly cress is super quick as well. Baby lettuce, spinach, arugula, yeah, Hackeri turnips. These are all really good to grow, especially when you consider their cold hardiness is really good. You can get these in really early in the season, start of April, middle April, and they'll be ready in time for like start of June, mid-June, and that gives you enough time to plant another crop of something else, and you can double your production for that space you have available. And anytime you can do that is great. And then you could even, like, I've done 4 successions of baby lettuce in the same bed in 1 year. So my standard bed size at the middle school is 50 square feet. And if I didn't have a grasp for how many days it takes for them to mature, then I would only get 50 square feet worth of production out of that space. But because it's really quick and I got 4 crops out of that space, then I turned 50 square feet into essentially 200 square feet. And so that's pretty important to know when you're dealing with a small growing space, a short growing season. That's how you can start to get these pretty eye-opening yield amounts per square foot, per area planted.
I've got a couple questions here. Barb, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just have questions about your days to maturity in the Bow Valley here. Yes. I think maybe with our cold nights and whatnot, would you suggest that our days to maturity are on the longer side of their suggested?
Yeah.
And then when you get into the hotter time of year in July and August, when the colder crops like spinach and arugula stop being productive because they're just kind of wilting, do you obviously then stop continuous seeding? Would you?
No, well, the first question, you are absolutely correct. The days to maturity in the cool times of the year it does get, you have to factor that in. I was going to talk more about that in a future class, but yeah,
Okay.
that is something to consider. That being said, with all of these, I've been able to, yeah, get them in early April, mid-April, and yeah, I've been, in the past, we've been able to harvest a lot of these, if not every single one, in time for the first market, which is around the start of June. So,
And I sometimes wonder if maybe I don't have some soil issues, or perhaps it's inconsistent watering. Radishes seem to split for me.
okay.
Do you know what I mean? Like right at the top where the green is, they will often split there. And I really try to harvest them at the right time, but I just wonder if it's an issue with watering soil or light or any number. What would you think?
Yeah, I've had some radishes, some radish crops do that. Um, it could be watering. I haven't had it happen too much. It could also be just letting them get a little bit too mature. So maybe picking them a little when they're a little bit smaller.
Okay. And the days to maturity are a little longer here, as
Yeah, yeah,
you've noticed from experience.
yeah. It is. But we'll talk about in a future class about how we can create little microclimates in order to create a little bit warmer conditions at night, and get them to that harvestable stage a little bit sooner. Um, and then actually, this is a decent photo of the radish stem. What I was talking about last time is seeing those signs of them going to that flowering stage. This main stem will start to, its trichomes will start to really develop on it. You'll see it kind of gets hairy like that, and as soon as I see that, hopefully I've cropped them out before then, but if I see that, I'm pulling all of them the next morning that I can get to them. And that would avoid some of the splitting issues.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
Marcy had a question in the chat,
Yep.
and it applies to a lot of folks in the Bow Valley. What if you are planting in a garden box on a deck? Our condo will not allow in-ground gardens.
What about it?
Marcy,
It,
or you good? Do you need a little more info there, Christian?
Hi, this is Marcy.
Hi, Marcy.
Hi, Christian. So, I mean, I'm learning tons from you, and I truly appreciate what it is that you're offering up. And what's hovering in the back of my mind is you're talking about, like, I'm just wondering if conditions would be different if I'm in a box as opposed to in the ground.
Yes, it can be different. There are some things like the radish here and the spinach and the hackeri turnips that are tap-rooted crops. And if you are growing in a box on your balcony, if that box is too shallow, then our cultivated tap-rooted plants, they're very sensitive. And so if you have a shallow box that you're growing in, then that will cause them to stress, because as soon as they feel a compaction layer, they'll pretty much shut down growing, or they'll bolt. So in that context of growing in a box, and hypothetically your goal was to grow any of these tap-rooted crops,
Right.
then you would just want to make sure that the box you're growing in has enough depth, like at least 12 inches of depth.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then I guess where you're limited with the box, you want to make sure that it's nice and deep to allow for that taproot to go down and not hit the compaction layer. On the other side of that, because they're tap uprooted rather than their roots spreading out, then there's less competition. So you can actually plant at a much greater density with them rather than, let's say, a broccoli or a tomato, which spreads its roots out a lot.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah.
But we will talk more about that.
Okay, and also somebody sent me a direct message, but it was meant for you.
Okay.
And the question is, can you eat radish greens?
Yeah. They're quite delicious. Just like lightly sautéed or steamed. Pretty much all brassica leaves are good to eat as well.
That's great.
Whether people enjoy them or not, I don't know. I think they're delicious.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you, Marcy.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll hop to the next slide. Okay, so another sort of classification that we could consider here is that there are poisonous plants that we could grow in our garden as long as we're aware that they are poisonous. There is these flowers up here. This is lupin, and they are poisonous. This is monkshood. There's also foxglove and potatoes and rhubarb. And so a lot of you might be wondering why you would want to grow a poisonous plant in your garden. But let's just say hypothetically, you had your garden in your backyard and there was one pathway on the way to that backyard that maybe some elk or deer can walk down. And so if you were to plant these beautiful flowers that are poisonous along there, then it would be somewhat of a confusion. They would smell those plants and recognize them as poisonous, and it would serve as a deterrent for the wildlife. So these are both perennials. They grow really easily, and as long as people that you care about and the people, your neighbors, are aware that you shouldn't be nibbling on them, then I think they have a place for them in the right kind of context. So just a design idea. And another classification for some normal garden plants that we would see around is some plants will self-seed really easily. And you can see that so like sometimes people call it oric, sometimes it's called mountain spinach, atriplex. I grew some of that in the garden a couple of years ago, and it's been self-seeding itself ever since. And there are other, we had violas or Johnny jump ups. All of these actually, except for Kiss Me Over the Garden Gate. I haven't planted those yet. But all of these will produce flowers, and they're all, really good for these ones, calendula, sunflower, borage, dill, Kiss Me Over the Garden Gate. They're all really good for insects, and they're all really beautiful. This one's just a tasty. This is kind of like a nice more wild spinach that grows really easily. But it's kind of up to you to decide whether it's a convenient thing. Some people like that they self-seed, and then some people consider it a nuisance that basically you have to start treating them as if they're weeds and you have to manage them. So I'm not going to make that decision for anybody, but it's good to know as somebody getting into gardening that there are some plants that will readily self-seed themselves. And sometimes it's nice and sometimes it's a pain in the butt. Sometimes pulling the mountain spinach out is kind of a pain in the butt, but you get to eat it at the same time. Or if you choose to weed that at the right time, you take it home and you mix it into your salad. So I'll let people decide based on their context and their goals.
Can you hear me?
Got a question from Jack there, Christian.
Yep.
Yeah,
Can you
go
hear me
ahead.
now? I know you're putting recording up, and that was good before, but now with all these lists of plants, are the actual PowerPoint going to be up as well? Because they're so good information, and I can't write them all down, and I just
Yeah, sure. I'll tell you what, Jack, I'll just copy and paste them. If that works for you, Lou. I can copy and paste the lists and we can include it for before next class.
so great. And what I'll probably do is when I have the list beside me, I'll rewatch the video and make notes. But I can stop and make a note.
Yep.
Yeah, like a Word doc, a PDF, that's something. So it's all these little lists to make. That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, I can do that. That won't take too much time on my part. Okay.
Sorry, there is one more.
Okay.
Sorry, it's just a comment. Someone's watching on their iPad and taking shots as they go. Not a question.
Oh yeah, there you go. All right. So this next list of plants, this is what we call dynamic nutrient accumulators. A lot of the cultivated vegetable crops that we grow, they can't access mineral nutrients in the soil the same way as these other plants. These plants, there's something about the way that they're able to get down into the soil and sort of mine out these really important nutrients. It makes them a valuable thing to grow around the garden, especially again, if you consider that made up scenario where I said that your vegetable garden is in the backyard and maybe your front garden is more exposed or vulnerable to the possibility of having wildlife come by, but you still want to grow something in the front yard. So these are plants that you could grow and then cut down and use as a source for your compost or to mulch. And it's a way of boosting your own fertility for these important plant nutrients on your own site. And so clover, I'm going to talk more about clover later on. This is a picture of clover. It's a great nitrogen fixer, which is one of the most important plant nutrients. I don't have time to go through this whole list, but I think you get the idea that there's a lot of things that you can grow that you're not necessarily going to eat, but they have a very practical value to incorporate in some part of your landscaping or whatever. And then there are things that we can't eat in there. There are chives, there's dandelions again, there's peppermint. Stinging nettle is actually, you can steam stinging nettle when it's young, and that's a very delicious, kind of the same way as radish greens, very nutritious as well. And then a lot of these, you wouldn't eat lupin though, obviously. A lot of these can be considered medicinal too. Yarrow is a very medicinal, multi-purpose plant.
Quick question.
Another question from Jack. Jack,
Yep.
Could you do something like put clover all around like tomato plants are fairly spaced out, a good foot or two in each one, and then put clover in between and around to fix nitrogen for them?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of organic farmers will, it's called undersowing. So once the plant, if you were to transplant a larger plant and then you've sown in like this low growing ground cover, then yeah, you can have like this living mulch layer that is that's fixing nitrogen, and yeah, that's a very viable option to do. Yeah, I guess the one thing that I'll add, since we're on clover right now, is this, you can see how this is a white flower, so that would be white clover. And the thing to understand about white clover is that it's a spreader. It would take over the garden and it would be hard to get rid of. I grow a lot of red clover along the edges of the garden at the schools, and red clover is a species that rather than spread, it clumps and it stays in its spot. So if you're thinking about incorporating clover, I would recommend looking into red clover seed over white clover. Um, and then also I would chop and drop the clover. You wouldn't really want the clover to get to the flowering stage, because if it gets to the flowering stages, then the seeds get dispersed and you start to have to weed the clover out of the bed. Whereas if you let it just before it gets to that flowering stage, if you chop it, then you can use that top of the clover as a mulch, or you can use it in your compost, and it's nitrogen rich. And the other cool thing about that is not only do you get a nitrogen rich vegetation that you can use in either of those ways, but when you chop the top of a plant, it needs to have somewhat of a balance between its roots and its shoots. So it'll slough off a bunch of its roots, and that just pulses nitrogen into the soil even more. So.
Got another question here. Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I just want to warn people, if they get the vetch that's called crown vetch that they grow along the highways for erosion control, it is impossible to get rid of, and it vines up over everything else and kind of shades them out. So beware.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I was kind of broadly talking about vetches. Yeah, there are different species of vetches, but yeah, good point. Thank you, Mary. The next category that I'll talk about here, they are called aromatic pest confusers. And so these plants are just so fragrant that a lot of the pests, the little insect pests who would do damage to your other crops, they can't locate them, because their main way of locating the plants that they want to eat is through their smell. And so if you plant really fragrant herbs around these other ones, then they can save a lot of crop damage in a natural way. And so I was talking about woody herbs, your sages, oregano, marjoram, thyme, rosemary earlier, and I was saying how I don't really harvest them in the first year. But what I do is, if I start those from seed and they're just small that first year, then I interplant them with all my brassicas. So your cabbages, your cauliflowers, your Brussels sprouts, all of those in that, the kales. So there is a little bug called a flea beetle that loves to eat the brassica leaves, but I'll put those woody herbs in between, and that just creates this fragrance. It stops these flea beetles from having a lot of success finding what they want to eat. So so then at the end of the season, even though I haven't harvested anything off of those woody herbs, they've played a role in the garden that year. I pot them up, bring them in the greenhouse, let them survive the winter, and then the next year they're much bigger, and I can put them out, and that's when I can start harvesting from them. Maybe not the rosemary, but the thyme and oregano is usually big enough by then. And next slide. And then to go along with that, there's also a lot of really great insectary plants. So these are plants that will create favorable conditions and create the right kind of food to feed the predatory insects that will feed on the herbivore insects that would feed on your crops. So borage and Forage and dandelion and Chinese forget-me-nots. They're really great for bees. Not so much for this what I'm talking about right now, but alyssum and dill flower and and uh, yeah, sagebrush. Those are really good at attracting in things like lacewings and these parasitoid little tiny wasps that they wouldn't sting us, but they need, like the alyssum and the dill flower. They get the pollen for the protein. They get the nectar for the sugars, and so that is like a supplementary part of their diet. And then the rest of their diet is they go out and they do a great work hunting down aphids and what's the other ones, flea beetles and white flies. So if you plant these around your garden, you'll be able to eat some of them, like your lemon balm and maybe some of your dill, but they're also providing this other service that makes your life easier. And then I'm not going to pretend like I'm an herbalist or anything, but there is a classification for a lot of plants that we can grow here in the Bow Valley that have medicinal value to them. Calendula, you can make a really nice skin salve out of them. Yarrow is antimicrobial, so if you cut yourself, you can use that on your skin or on your cut to clean it. Willow. I mean, we don't have a lot of. I just had to put that in there because that's what aspirin comes from. Originally, periwinkle. Again, we don't so much have that to grow, but there are a number of really important cancer drugs that are derived from it. And yeah, I just wanted to include this one slide just to consider that not everything that we grow in the garden, again, maybe it's in the front yard that's more exposed to wildlife. And so some of these are less prone to getting eaten or attracting wildlife, and they can still be beautiful. This is prairie coneflower, also echinacea, so something to consider. And then I use the term, and gardeners use the term a lot, about plant hardiness. So I figured I'd throw in a couple slides in terms of plant hardiness. This slide here refers to, this is for perennial plants, for the hardiness of perennial plants. And basically, we all know here in the mountains, it gets down to a good -35 to -40. So our plant hardiness zone is somewhere between 3 and 4. And so if you're considering planting any perennial plants, then it's worth taking the time and looking up what hardiness zones they're good to. And if it's up in the 5 or 6 range, you know that you're not going to have success. Or if you really want to grow something in those range, you're going to have to do a lot of extra work keeping them warm over the winter. But we should be aiming for anything here, mostly in the 30s. Sometimes you can get away with something that's rated for a 4. And then this is a snapshot of one of the spreadsheets. I'm going to talk more about these sheets from this book called Crop Planning. The organic vegetable growers. This is where I get a lot of really helpful information. But you can see here in this column over here, they're saying if it's shaded in, then these crops are considered the hardiest, the things that you can plant earliest in the spring, and they can deal with some very strong, some really cool nights. So anything you see in here, scallions, lettuce, brassica greens, so like mustard greens, really good to get going. Kale, kohlrabi, all of these that are shaded in can take those cold nights, and they might not thrive, but they'll survive, and you'll get a crop out faster. And then again, if you can create a little bit of a microclimate by giving it a little bit protection on those cold nights, they'll survive, and they'll grow quite nicely. Then in this next column, these are the hardy crops. So they're shaded in. And again, this is for Ontario, Quebec growers. But I guess to give you context here, yeah, like I've planted lettuce late March. Pretty much all of these I've been able to get in the ground, and they've survived in late March, early April, giving them a little bit of protection. Whereas these that are in the hardy crop area, they're going in, for me, I would put them outside in the ground around late April, early May. And then this last one, these would be the frost sensitive crops. So I hope that's helpful for everybody to see. And then on the other side, we can see how they stand up later in the season to those late the fall cold snaps. And so one thing about that is, like peas, you can see how peas here are really hardy in the spring, but once they get to the fall, they're not very good at all. Like once they get to their flowering stage, then they'll get killed by the frost. But when they're in their vegetative juvenile stage, they can take really cold weather. I hope that's helpful for people. And in a future class, I'm going to show you my schedule that I've created. I've come to kind of rely on when I put each one of these in, when it's safe enough to let them go in. So I'll expand on that a little bit more. And sometimes gardeners and farmers like to refer to crops in terms of being heavy feeders or light feeders. And this refers to like how much nutrients they're going to pull out of the soil in order to do their thing. And so you can see over here in this column, these are all the crops that you would want to use more fertilizers for, whether it's compost or if you choose a synthetic, then that's your choice. But all of these, they would draw out more nutrition, or they would require more in order to produce at the level that you want them to. And then on the flip side of that, these are all crops that, relatively speaking, you don't need to use as much compost or whatever you choose to fertilize with, and they won't pull as much out. And so I kind of like to consider these, it's not a perfect rule because we know that there aren't very many rules in gardening, but you can see if you look at these heavy feeders, they tend to be crops that we grow to their later stages of development. Like this has gone all the way flower and seed, all the way flower, seed, and fruit, flower, seed, and fruit, flower, seed, and fruit. Almost like at the very tip, broccoli is of going to the flower. So it makes sense that they draw more nutrients out of the soil, because we were talking about how much nutrients plants will pack into their seeds for that next generation. Whereas over here, they tend to be crops that we grow to their juvenile stage and not too far into it. And so that makes sense if they're not pulling as much out. There are some outliers. Spinach, we just grow to its juvenile stage, but it's still considered a heavy feeder. And then over here, peas and beans, yeah, we grow them to their flowering and fruiting stage and seed producing stage. But as we'll see, they are part of the plant family known as the legumes or the Fabaceae, and they have this special relationship with these nitrogen fixing bacteria in their root nodules, and so that's what, yeah, we're growing them to their fruit stage, but they have this special relationship with this soil microbe that they can actually produce a lot of their own nitrogen fertilizer, which is a special thing. Now this is a map of the origins, center of origins for a lot of the main agricultural crops that we grow, and beyond just being kind of an interesting map to see where a lot of the things we eat have originally come from. I think it's kind of telling to look at it and to consider. It kind of teaches us a little bit on how to, you know, what we can expect from them. When we get to more into seed starting, we'll talk about how some crops like tomatoes and peppers and zucchini, I think zucchini, yeah, squash, they come from Central America. And when we start seeds, when we start these seeds, they need the soil medium to be around 24 to 27 degrees Celsius, or at least they'll sprout a lot more consistently when the soil is warmer. And so we can't start them outside. We need to start them indoors with a little heat mat. But when we consider that they're from Central America, that makes a lot of sense that they wouldn't start unless the soil was warmer. And then also, I don't know if it's on this map, but those woody herbs, those oregano, marjoram, thyme, rosemary, they come from the Mediterranean region, and that region tends to have more rocky, sandy soils, which drain really easily. And so that makes sense when you consider that when you're potting these Mediterranean woody culinary herbs, we should make that soil medium rockier and sandier because they like free draining soils. They don't like water around the root system. They need to get watered, but they don't want their roots to be kind of like sitting in a puddle. And so, yeah, if we consider that that's where they come from, then that makes a lot of sense. So just wanted to put that in there. Because there are those interesting kind of correlations, and when we put it that way, yeah, makes sense. Any questions?
I think we might have one in the chat here. Oh, just a comment, great stuff. Lots of new connections.
Nice. Relationships, it's all about relationships. Okay, so a lot of this stuff has been coming from this, not all of it, but these books, Edible Forest Gardens, is just an incredible resource. If I were to do this class and not mention how amazing this is, I wouldn't be doing or I'd be blatantly copywriting, or like there'd be some sort of copyright infringement or something like that. So definitely got to mention. And these books are more geared towards, as you can see by the title, Edible Forest Gardens. So it's more geared toward a perennial plant sort of agriculture. And they make a lot of really cool arguments in there of why we should move away from annual vegetables and try to become more perennial. Once they're established, it's a lot less work. But I don't have time to get into that too much. I just wanted to mention it because at the back they have really, really great appendices in the back. Appendices? Appendices. We'll go with that. But the back is like, when I crack this open, I can like lose an hour of my life without even noticing it. It goes through just like hundreds of different plants, kind of explaining what hardiness zone they do best in. what light preferences, what shade tolerances they have, how moist the soil should be, the pH. It gives so much information, and then it breaks it down, plants down by like the different uses they have. So if anybody out there is liking this content, then I couldn't recommend this book anymore. All right, this is a tough one. But we're gonna go. So I want to talk about the idea of ecological succession in order for people to understand weeding practices and the way that we manage our gardens. Try to put that in context. And so the theory of ecological succession is basically that progressive change from one ecosystem or habitat to another by natural processes. Oh, I didn't even finish that sentence. See, I told you, Lou, I didn't finish this. But so originally when they came up with this theory of ecological succession, it was seen as a very linear kind of process. When there is a disturbance, and a disturbance is inevitable, whether it's a man-made disturbance or it's a naturally occurring disturbance, then nature tends to want to be over here in this state of vegetation, biodiversity, and complexity in the ecological succession. It tends to want to move in this direction, but inevitably something's going to happen, whether it's a different scale or different intensity, that can start this kind of ecological succession clock all over again. And so for a natural example would be like a forest fire or glaciation or a windstorm that blows over and creates a gap in a forest. Those are all examples of a disturbance, and that takes us back to an earlier stage of the succession. Obviously, the scales can be different, and the climates can make everything complicated because these things can happen in different climates, and the legacy of what was there to begin with, they all affect them. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because it is, the further we get down here, the more complex it is. But we'll kind of be thankful that a lot of our gardening and a lot of our agriculture is kept in a artificially early successional stage. And what you got to understand about these, so like it can be a natural process, or it can be a gardener going and plowing their garden, or a farmer plowing a field. And so even though nature wants to move in this direction, if there's enough soil moisture and the conditions are right, this is the way that succession will go until there is a disturbance. And so the way that we garden and the way that we grow our own food is we're always creating these disturbances. And we have to start understanding that these disturbances create the perfect conditions for these plants that we call weeds. And we love to blame the weeds, and we love to, shake our fists and rue them. But this is just nature kind of doing its thing. And so these early succession plants, when we create bare soil or when we stir the soil, nature abhors a vacuum, and it wants to fill it. It wants to protect the soil from erosion. It wants to bind it up. And so if we keep on disturbing the soil and we keep on getting these plants that we call weeds, then we can blame them all we want, but we're playing a pretty active role in this. And so that's why it might sound like a little wishy-washy for me to ask people not to call them weeds, and I still call them weeds because we are we're trying to have a conversation and have a mutual language, but there are better words for them, more, if I can click to my next slide, there are more apt definitions and words that we could use, because when we think about a weed, and if we were to start calling them opportunists, they are species that are highly dispersive and expansive in their behavior. Okay, and so that's these first two. And we think about a lot of weeds that we have in our garden. What they want to do is they want to fill in that gap. They're kind of act like pioneers. So there's a disturbance. They act as pioneers. They put a lot of their energy into getting established and getting to that mature phase as fast as possible, and then producing as many seeds as possible. And then there's also these expansive plants that will grow through those rhizomes and bind up the soil. I showed a picture of myself with the quackgrass in the first class, and I was making a sad face. But at the same time, I understood that what I was doing to the soil every year was just creating the perfect conditions for those plants to come in and perform what their ecological niche is. So it's kind of like a catch-22, in that when we want to prepare a bed for a planting, we do have to prepare the soil a little bit. We want to get a little bit of oxygen down into the root system and lessen compaction. And if we're direct seeding a really small, fine seed down into the soil, then we want to make really fine soil conditions so that when we cover those seeds, they'll be snug in that soil and they'll be able to germinate really well. So there's like this catch-22. If you think about our problem with the weeds and the way that we grow our own food, is we can get mad at the weeds, but we have both also have to understand that we're just creating the conditions that they're best adapted to thrive in. So that's why I'll talk more about the tools that I use to minimize that disturbance. But also, like, if you're in your home garden and you create a disturbance and you know that there's going to be this response from these opportunistic seeds, they will want to fill that space and cover it in, then you should just be ready for that natural response rather than shaking your fist at the weeds. And so that brings me back to the point I made about understanding that when a weed is in the cotyledon stage, then it's really easy to pull, right? You don't have to come back multiple times and pull on it. So if we do have to make those disturbances in the garden, then you should make a note in your calendar 2 weeks later to come back and get them when they're really small and pull them out and have them dealt with like that. It's when they get established and get that energy in the root, that's when they get really hard. It's when these dispersives get to the flowering and seed stage, and rather than just having 2 or 3 of them in your garden and ignoring them because we tend to hate weeding, if we let them get to that mature stage and they're dispersives, then we've just let them win, you know? So understanding that when we disturb any ecosystem, whether it's a macro level or it's a micro level of our garden, then nature's going to have a response, and we should be ready to kind of respond as well if we don't want those weeds to take over. Or if you prefer any of these terms, I feel like they're better. They're more accurate. I know we like to kind of blame the plant but they're just filling their role. Does anybody have any comments on that?
Think you're good to go?
Yeah. Okay, sweet. I guess my other point, I kind of don't want to repeat myself too much, but my other point with it, if I can, then weeds can actually teach us a lesson. Like these opportunists, these pioneers, they have lessons to offer. So if we stop calling them weeds and we think of them as pioneers or so forth, I included some of those plants early in the medicinal slide. Like I put dandelions in there because they do have a medicinal value. And I wanted to talk about this because nature does want to move towards more complexity and deeper soil and healthy conditions. And the funny thing about these plants that we call weeds is that they are doing a service. They're trying to perform a service in that disturbed ground. Like dandelions, they have a very strong taproot. When I was talking about the beets and the carrots and the radishes about having like this wimpy taproot that as soon as it feels a compaction layer, it'll stop. That's because we've been selecting for traits that are like good to our palate for thousands of years, and it's made those taproots weak. Whereas these wild, uncultivated, taprooted plants like a dandelion, they will appear in compacted soil because they can break up that compaction and help move it to the next level of succession. They also, I included dandelions in the dynamic nutrient accumulator because they can show up in areas that are weak in calcium, and they're really good at bringing calcium up from the roots, and they're fixing the soil. And so sure, we don't want gardens that are gardens that are full of dandelions. We want to be growing edible vegetables in there. But we can take that lesson and go like, if I keep on getting dandelion problems, then I should learn from it. I should know that I should take steps to lessen compaction and maybe take some eggshells and grind them up and put them in the soil because the eggshells are good with calcium, you know? So when we start to stop looking at them as weeds and more as pioneers and these plants that are trying to fix problems with the soil, then we can see that they're indicating steps that we should be learning in order to help that happen. But far too often we don't think about it that way. We think of them as like this scourge, and we bring out the herbicide and we spray them with the herbicide. And what we're doing is we keep on taking succession back in the wrong direction rather than learning from nature and working with it and moving forward. So I use dandelions there as an example, but clover is sometimes considered a weed, and we talked about how that is a nitrogen fixer. And so they will do better in disturbed soils that are low in nitrogen, and they're doing better because they can create their own nitrogen. You know, so there's these indications that we can start to learn. And then I guess my last point with all this is that if dandelions are such a scourge, then why do you barely ever see any in the forest? Right? They're not in the forest because the soil and all those conditions have moved past that, and so they're not needed there anymore. So just a different perspective on that. I think weeding is like this one thing that everybody thinks about of gardening as being the worst part of it, and like, I don't want to garden because I don't want to be bent over weeding. And so I've been trying to chip away at this, all the things that we can do, the different ways we can look at gardening to make it easier. That was a bit of a rant, but I feel like it was worth it. Yeah, I'll skip over that one. that being said, there are some weeds that are very persistent, and I didn't actually mention this invasive. There are invasive species that can be a threat to natural vegetation, so those aren't to be taken lightly. I do fully recognize these are plants that aren't from this bioregion originally. They don't have any competitor, or they don't have any predators, and so they do. I won't just say that all weeds are equal. There are some that can affect our ecosystems in a very negative way. So nothing's that simple. And then there's this comfrey is great as a dynamic nutrient accumulator, but they have really persistent roots, same as lovage. If you disturb that root system, then it will like explode into a number of different plants and be really hard to get rid of. Probably the same as what Mary talked about as with the vetches that they use. So these, if you're going to grow like a comfrey as a dynamic nutrient accumulator, and you plant that in your yard somewhere, you better make sure that you want that there for a number of years, because they are really hard to get out. Same as lovage. Lovage is like a wild celery, very, very intense. Quackgrass can have that as well. You break the root system up and it just makes more plant. They're very persistent. I don't have time to talk about those. Lianas, woody vines, we don't really have them here. Although actually yellow clematis is a yellow vine, and that's an invasive. Epiphytes is something that grows off of, I totally said I wasn't going to talk about this. Now I'm talking about epiphytes are like a plant that doesn't grow in soil, but like on other trees. Orchids is an epiphyte. And a lot of people make the mistake, I've heard, that they over fertilize orchids. And so if you think about their natural kind of niche of growing basically in the bark of a tree, then yeah, they don't need that much fertility. Ephemerals is a cool one. These are all cool, but I'm running out of time. Okay, yeah, so this is what I really want to talk about. I just don't think it plays really well in this format. I do think it is really, really important to practice plant identification, but in this this Zoom meeting, I don't know if it's going to be all that fun to talk about or listen about. But it's really, really practical to just start practicing seeing plants and identifying them and just working on it. It's not going to come in one day, but there are tools to use to go. So this is an edible medicinal plant guide that will have descriptions of plants, and you can use this. Go for a hike and just practice reading the descriptions on the pages and looking at plants and starting to see the names for plants and the way that they are described. My experience of why learning to identify plants is really important is because I've had volunteers come in the garden and they're new to the garden. So I'll start you off easy. Maybe you can do like a little bit of weeding, you know? And so they'll go, and I've had experiences where I check on them 5-10 minutes later, and they've pulled up like a whole row of baby radishes, because they, as a new gardener, sometimes they're not used to looking at which plants we actually want and identifying them, and which plants are the opportunists that are there just because I turned the soil a couple weeks ago, you know? So that's pretty practical. Like why go to the work of planting radishes if we can't even tell the difference between the radishes and the lamb's quarter and the groundsel and all that. So, and then the other reason I think it's important to practice our plant identification is this thing called an umwelt. And this comes from a book called Naming Nature by Carol Kasich-Yoon. This was a really interesting read. And she talks about how we all have this thing called an Umwelt, which is like this innate tendency to perceive and name and want to order the living world. And it sounds kind of like hippie-ish off the start, but there is actually some pretty strong science behind it. There are a couple case studies where people sustained brain injuries in their lower brainstem, and one of the symptoms of these brain injuries is that they could not identify any living thing. They could identify like mason jar or lamp or desk, and like they could identify and knew what those were, but if they were shown a picture of a bird or a dandelion or whatever, their brains were just blank. And so it was like this really interesting concept that we're all born with this. We all want to be able to make sense of all the living things that surround us. As we have evolved into a modern culture that gets most of our food from the supermarket, I'd say that our Umwelt for plant life is severely atrophied. And so when I talk about plant identification with adults, I tend to get some funny looks. Like people kind of look at me as if I'm, why am I using these weird words? And like, why would they ever have to know them? And like, they're adults. Why have they gone so long in their life and they're hearing these new words? This is new language, and I get funny looks, but I've had a very interesting experience at the school gardens, especially this spring, summer. Obviously school was canceled this year, and I was gonna start this program of getting the grade 4s I was really gonna get them to identify plants and work on that. And everything I was gonna say was gonna be very casually using this botanical language. It was based from reading this. And the staff at the daycare were skeptical at the first because they were like some of these words like nasturtium and nasturtium and calendula, and they're like, these are long words. The kids aren't really going to understand them. They won't get them. But I started using these words very specifically, and in past years, I would just let them eat anything. I thought it was, well, not everything because there's poisonous plants in there, but like any edible plant, they would come in, and I just thought it was cute that they would be begging me to eat spinach or lettuce and so forth. So I let them eat. But this year I was like, nah, I'm going to make them anything you want to eat in the garden. You have to identify it first. And so the first week they kind of looked at me funny, but by the third and fourth week, they could tell the difference between fennel and dill, and like their skills of perception, it came so easily to them. And so I've found the same thing for me as an adult. Like I'm kind of new to this too, but it might feel weird identifying plants at the start and taking a little bit of extra time, but once you have it, it's kind of like, it's like you see the color blue and you know it's the color blue. If I'm walking through the forest and I see out of the corner of my eye a fleabane, then which is a small flowering plant, purple corolla with the yellow head in the middle. It comes really naturally. So anyways, this is a long way of saying I really think it's important to practice these skills, and you'll see as they develop for you, you'll be able to make more meaningful observations about what you see in the garden or in a forest walk. And if you do make mistakes, then you'll have the vocabulary to put that into context and learn from your mistakes. So I'll move on from this slide. I wanted to say a whole other thing over here, but I'm running little bit short on time, so I'll come back to this in a future class. So let's move on to more about naming. So we have common names for plants. And so this is the pros and cons. So we have common names and we have like the botanical scientific names. Common names are approachable and pronounceable, and so we tend to like them. But on the other side of that, common names change readily from region to region, and it makes it really hard to be certain you're talking about the same plants. And we actually saw this earlier in the classes when I think it was Marcy and I were talking about quaking aspen and poplars, and those are two common names. But I looked up the scientific botanical name, and it turned out we were talking about the same thing. So it's very practical in that sense to start to think about the scientific names. They're standardized throughout the world, which makes it a practical tool. On the other side, the not so good thing about it is that the concept of scientific names, of them being based on Latin, it kind of has like this twinge of kind of linguistic colonialism, if you know what I mean, which isn't the greatest thing, especially when you have botanists that are going to the rainforest of Brazil, where the traditional people of those lands who have worked with those plants for time immemorial, they have their own names for them, and then we have like this kind of colonial injustice that we're doing to the plants in a sense of giving them like a Eurasian name. So I'm not too fond about that, but it is what it is. Ultimately, the scientific names, because of this standardizing and because of being able to know that you're talking about the same plant, is very, very useful. And it's not a perfect system by any means. There's a lot of arguing even within the scientific community. It's very polarizing trying to classify and so forth. But again, like, just consider that this naming system is just a tool that helps us understand complex concepts. And it can have really interesting, even though the names, I have some examples down here, even though the names are seem kind of odd when we read them and foreign, they have cool, meaningful backgrounds. So this Achillea Mellifolium is the Latin scientific name for yarrow, which is interesting because you can see Achillea, it comes from Achilles, the Greek general, the historical figure. And he used to use yarrow as that antimicrobial to clean cuts of his soldiers in the field. So we talked about that earlier, and we can see here how embedded in its Latin name, we get a little bit of a history about it, and we understand one of its uses. So that's kind of interesting. I hope you all appreciate that as well. And then the next one, this is the botanical scientific name for chocolate, the tree that chocolate is derived from. And so this, if we were to translate, it actually comes from the Mayan language. It means food of the gods. And if anybody wants to argue with me on that not being the most appropriate name for that plant, then let's have it out, because chocolate is awesome. The next one is Zea mays. So that's the botanical name for corn. And so that also comes from the Mayan language. It means grain of life. So maize, well, what is commonly called corn, was so important to that culture. They honored that plant by naming it the grain of life. You'll also see vulgaris at the end of the epitaph, because all botanical names have two names. And so you'll see vulgaris as the species, the specific And vulgaris is just a way of saying common. So if you ever see that at the end of it, it means common, just not particularly cultivated or different. It's just found mostly to describe weeds. And then also you'll find a lot of plants in this scientific naming system. You'll come across officinalis quite often. And that was like kind of a tip of the hat to the Middle Ages herbalists. It's basically a way of saying that that plant was used as some form of a medicine by the herbalists and the doctors in the Middle Age, and it translates to, it comes from the outbuilding. So in any doctor's office in the Middle Ages would have like this outbuilding where they would grow the plants that they derived medicine from. So anytime you see that, that means it was traditionally used as a medicine. Borage is, are we good?
Well,
that's okay. I spent enough time on that slide anyways.
We're good. Sorry.
Oh yeah. But yeah, I just, the whole naming of plants, I know common names is, we'll use common names a lot, and we are pretty much alienated from these scientific names because they sound too fancy. And to be honest, like experts use them to make them feel good about themselves sometimes, you know, because they are kind of fancy. But they do have, there is, and like I said, they're not perfect, but they are worth kind of paying attention to, because you'll see some patterns emerge the more you pay attention to. Another tool for identifying plants out in the field is this idea of a dichotomous key. If you ever go out, then it's just kind of like a, it's a yes or no kind of way of figuring it out, and you can eventually get to them. I'm going to include a couple field, like PDF versions of field guides that have that dichotomous key, and you'll see what I mean. But running out of time here again, so we'll roll. And then so in the first class we talked about the plant structures and functions, and I didn't really have space to talk about the different structure or the different forms of those structures. And so we're not going to go into a full explanation here, but I just felt like if I left it at that and we just think about a root system of them all looking the same, then we wouldn't be doing it justice. So here are some examples of the different forms that you would find. And then over here is some definitions of the common herbaceous plant root systems that you'll find. And luckily, I put that reminder, but we already talked about how if you have a tap-rooted plant and you're growing in soil that isn't deep, or if you're growing in containers, then you got to make them deep containers so that that our cultivated tap-rooted crops don't stress out too much. But I will copy and paste these so people can read them if they want. And then there's also these things called adventitious roots. And so this is a cool example. This is roots that kind of emerge from not the primary spot where the roots started. So this is obviously something we can't grow here in Canmore, but this is adventitious roots forming off of a tomato plant. And actually, Jack asked me a question last class asking about, you know, are there any situations where we let plants get leggy? It was something like that his question was, and I talked about leeks. But another example where I don't mind letting seedlings get leggy is for tomatoes, because if you look at the stem of the tomato, they have all these fine hairs, which are actually called trichomes. And tomatoes will create these adventitious roots really easily. So that's the reason why I don't mind letting my tomato seedlings get a little bit less light and therefore get a little bit more leggy, because I can plant them deeper into the soil and that'll create more of a root system, which creates more surface area for grabbing water and the nutrients that they need. And then we have some examples of different forms that you can see stems take. It's not, when we talk about a stem, it's not just like all plants have the same kind of stems. You know, they can have shrub, or they can have the trunks, they can have axillary branches, they can be thicket forming. You know, there's all sorts of different ways. And I know I talked about the rhizomes and the stolons as being roots, but it's actually modified stem tissue. Don't mean to confuse you, but sometimes botany is just confusing because there really aren't any rules. And then a couple diagrams to show you that within just the basic stem, there are names for the nodes where there is a break in the stem. And then there's the space between the nodes. There are axillary, like an axillary stem would be a stem with multiple stems coming off of it, supporting leaves. The stem supporting the leaf is a petiole. The stem supporting a flower is technically a pedicle. Oh, yeah, over there. And so I'm not going to go off on all these details, but I want people to know that there are names for these, and the more specific we can learn the names, then the more specific observations we can make, and the better we can communicate between gardeners and botanists about what's going on with our plants. When I have people ask me what's sick with my plants, and they have really, really basic vocabulary, then I have to really, it's really hard for me to know what's going on if people can't even describe what's going on with their plants. So we're not going to go fully into this, but just knowing that names, once we start to learn the names for things, then we can see them a lot clearer, right? And then we don't just call it a leaf. We got our petioles down here. We got our base, midrib. We can see our veins. The edge of the leaf is the margin. The end is the apex. And then when we start to look at the leaf arrangements, if they're coming off at different parts of the stem, it's alternate. If it's right across from each other, it's opposite. Yeah. The more you start to go out in the garden and look at plants and look at this variation, a whole new world of diversity is going to kind of open up. I kind of have this metaphor of when I started to look at these plant structures and the names for them and the different forms that they come on. I went from like a walk in the forest, went from like somebody playing a solo on the kazoo to like having a grand symphony orchestra. Like you could see so much details, and it's still happening. And these names, these words that we have to describe them shows that diversity, and they help us identify different species. So I'm gonna roll through these because we're running out of time. This is the different ways that flowers can be displayed on a plant. So give you a little bit of idea there. And then this is how the petals of the flower are displayed. You can see the diversity there. Once you start picking up on that, you can start to see flowers and leaves are two of the best ways. The variation that we see in those forms, those are some of the best ways that we can distinguish between different species and get a positive identification on them. And then, okay, so the other thing about flowers is that they don't play by the rules. So Yeah, so there are perfect flowers that have both male and female structures on them. And so I have the example here of tomatoes and peas. Those self-pollinate really easily. They have very closed flower structures, and their pollen can fall onto the stigma and they can fertilize their own flowers. So if you're growing tomatoes and you want to try to produce more fruits, which you should, because that's the whole point, then you can increase those chances by tapping on those what we call stick trusses, and that creates a better chance of getting that pollination and fertilization. And then there are Monitious plants, and this, I think it's Greek, it means single house. And so you can see here on these zucchinis, you can see how the structure within them are different. This is clearly a pistillate structure, and this is a stigmatic structure. And so I've actually had people talk to me about because zucchinis take up more space in the garden, we generally can only grow a couple of them. And so I've had a couple people go like, what's wrong with my zucchini plants? I keep getting flowers, but I'm not getting fruits. Do I have to change something about the way I'm providing nutrition for them? And so forth. There's all these, people are just kind of grasping for reasons why they're not getting the zucchini fruit. And I predict that sometimes, because squash plants will produce a female flower over there and a male flower over there, and sometimes they'll only have male flowers out, or they'll only have female flowers out. And so it can be a little bit difficult, and sometimes we need to identify those flower structures and go in there with a little paintbrush and actually help out that pollination and pick up some of the pollen and deliver it directly to the female. And that'll increase your chances of getting more zucchini if you only have a couple. But if you're growing more, then the chances are a lot better. And then there are dioecious plants that have incomplete flowers. So they're like this, where one entire plant will only produce female flowers, and then another plant will only produce male flowers. And if you don't have them close enough for the pollinators to transfer that pollen, then you're not going to get any fruit whatsoever. So just a heads up, it's an interesting world when it comes to the sexuality of flowering plants. And I mean, I guess the point is, like, if you know these little details, then when you go to plant something, you can look that up really quickly. Thankfully, we live in the age of information. You can just Google really quickly and see it. You can make your decisions based on that. When I talk about all this botanical language and the way we can describe plants, I am still very much a student in this. One of my favorite YouTube channels is this guy called Tony Santoro, and he has this YouTube channel called Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't. And I wouldn't watch it with your kids because he has a very foul mouth, and but he's very, very passionate about plants, and he uses botanical language really well. Like when I practice, I just listen to him and practice the way he points out different features of plants. He's really good to check out. I apologize for his foul language, but he also has really insightful thoughts about, I was talking about succession earlier and native plants, and he's really, really insightful in that way as well. So I recommend him. And yeah, I'm just gonna gear right through this. So when we talk about plants and classification, this is sort of like the hierarchy of classifying. This is like super scientific and technical, but understanding them from this perspective can be helpful as well. All plants are in the kingdom of plants, like we are in the kingdom of Animalia. And then they can be subdivided into a handful of different phylums. So it gets a lot easier for us to understand at that point. And then we classify them and we put them in orders. And so these, we're not going to go too far into them. I might talk a little bit about the phyla, and what I really want to talk about right now is how we talk about plants as being in the same family. And so this is common garden plants broken down by family. And I just needed to put this up so that when we talk about crop rotation moving forward, you'll see that rotating the crops is important because all of these are susceptible to the same pest pressures, and same with these, you know. So we want to be able to move our plants into different soil every year in order to mitigate plant pressures. And yeah, this is just kind of like laying a little bit of foundation for that discussion later. Also, I guess you would also say that the leaves of these or the flowers of these all tend to be very similar in their structures, and the seeds can be similar, same with these. So there are patterns in that botanical language and those identification keys that tell us a lot about how to manage, but also how they relate to each other. And yeah, this, I'm not going into super detail. I just wanted to explain, because in the first class, probably like the second slide, I was going to say a whole bunch of stuff about, I said that I would have to say things about plants that weren't true. I'm generally talking about garden plants, which are flowering plants. But these are the different phylum that are out there. So algae, I don't know, like technically that's a plant because it's photosynthesizing, but it definitely doesn't have roots and it definitely doesn't have flowers. So when I was trying to explain just in the most general sense, I was disrespecting algae a little bit. And then we got our mosses. So mosses don't have root systems. So when I was talking about roots and saying that the job of the root system is to take up water and take up nutrients, mosses have rhizoids. So really the only functions they perform for the mosses is as that anchor. But they take up their nutrients through their leaves and their water through their leaves. So if anybody wants to start a moss garden at home, which they should because they're awesome, you don't want to water the roots for them. You want to spray them with a bottle and get the leaves moist. That is, that's how you look after mosses. Yeah, there's just too much to explain. Sorry, Lou. Lycophytes, so this is a whole other phylum of plants that they don't produce flowers and seeds the way I've talked about in general. They produce these spores. So, and they don't really have true leaves, technically they're scales. So there is a bunch of lies that I told you about plants that don't even make sense, but it's because they never want to fit into a single category. We also have gymnosperms. So again, they're not flowering plants. They're generally like cones. And like, I wish I could say like conifer plants are evergreens, but we all know that larches drop their, like they got to be these rebels who drop their needles. So you can't even say that conifers are evergreens because there's that one plant that's a deciduous. And then we got the juniper bush, which they're supposed to be cone bearing, but they produce berries. That doesn't make any sense. But apparently the berries are just succulent cones. They don't look like, So there's all these really, and I know this isn't pertaining to gardens so much, but that's why at the start it's hard to make a rule in botany, because there's just so much different species and so much diversity, and there's always got to be at least a couple rebels that break the rules. And yeah, that's it. Done. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody.
That was amazing. You packed a lot of information into this workshop, and I know you had to skip over so much and leave a lot of stuff out, but really good base of knowledge to give everyone. And yeah, just kind of pique our interest in kind of pursuing yeah, the whole classification thing a bit more. Does I think we got a question in the chat here. Oh, just a comment. These workshops are incredible. Thanks so much. Does anybody have any questions for Christian? Don't see any coming in. Christian, what's our next workshop on Wednesday?
Next one is about plant tissues and how the structures of cellular biology, how like just understanding really basically what's going on at a cellular level. It helps us understand why we provide nutrients, or why they need certain kind of nutrients, and where they use it in their structures.
Great. All right. Well, looking forward to it. And yeah, just keep building up this base of knowledge. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Take care.
Right on. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Christian.
Yeah, thanks, Lou.
See you Wednesday.
Yeah.